your trusted source for information on the energy transition. This is the Insider's Guide to Energy podcast. Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me is my co-host, Jeff McCauley. And this week, we're talking to Steven Quiring, Chief Scientist at Storm Impact. Steven, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Chris. Great to be here.
We're excited to have you here. We've been looking forward to this episode for quite some time. I think it was quite a while ago when you and I first had our conversation. And we are in the height of storm activity and things going on. So with a company named Storm Impact, and we're talking about energy, what is it you do?
Storm Impact is focused on helping utilities be storm ready and climate resilient. And so what we mean by that is that we want to help utilities optimally prepare before storms occur so that they can optimize their response by having the right number of crews in the right location so that they can quickly and efficiently restore the power. And this is for things like tornadoes and thunderstorms and winter storms and hurricanes. And then we also talk about things on a longer time scale. And so this idea of being climate smart. So a climate smart utility is one that's going to be investing in infrastructure hardening in a way that optimizes the resilience of their grid and reduces the likelihood and the duration of outages as we see changes in future frequency and severity of things like hurricanes and tornadoes.
Well, you mentioned hurricanes, and as Chris highlighted in the beginning here, we're just launching into this year's hurricane season. And I'm not sure about our listeners, but I've been seeing reports of record high temperatures in the Atlantic. And everybody always says that that generates to more and more powerful storms. So what can we expect going into this year's hurricane season?
It's a great question. And as we sit here just approaching the start of the hurricane season, it looks to be an extremely active hurricane season. And there's a couple ingredients that go into driving that, Jeff. The first is, as you mentioned, sea surface temperatures. So the warmer the ocean, the more energy there is for latent heat, the evaporation of water, and that energy is what powers hurricanes. And so all else being equal, a warmer ocean, and we're seeing near record temperatures in the main development region in the tropical Atlantic. And so that is leading to an enhanced probability of more and stronger hurricanes this season. The second is related to wind shear. And so wind shear is a change in direction or speed with height. And when we have conditions like El Nino, that tends to result in more wind shear. And so that decreases the probability of hurricanes. We're exiting an El Nino phase and entering a La Nina phase, which results in more favorable conditions in terms of shear. And so both sea surface temperatures and shear are favorable. Therefore, all of the major seasonal forecasting predictions, like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and Colorado State University, the European Center, and many others, are all forecasting above normal numbers of hurricanes and above normal numbers of major hurricanes for this upcoming season.
So for utilities that are listening to this, what can actually be done about that? I mean, you mentioned the near term and the long term. So now we're on the order of weeks and months. What is it that a utility can even do to brace for that kind of impact? Or again, it's not really known. This is probabilistic. So what's the preparation that can be done weeks and months ahead of time?
Excellent. Yeah, utilities at this point should be looking to make preparations. And while they can't redirect a hurricane or move their service territory very easily, they can do things on the storm preparation and storm response side that allow them to more efficiently restore power after a storm occurs. So the areas that we help utilities is in determining what their resource needs are. How many crews will be required to efficiently restore power after a hurricane occurs? So our software can be used to do what if scenarios, kind of a planning or tabletop exercise where we can take a hypothetical storm, pass it over a particular track. So, what would Hurricane Katrina look like on Sandy's track? And then predict what the impacts will be in terms of damage and customers interrupted for a given utility. That gives them a sense of what the worst case could be and allows them to identify how many the material needs and the crew needs. A second area, in addition to those kind of tabletop and long-term planning exercises, is actually putting tools in their hands that they can use in the days leading up to a storm. So our hurricane outage prediction model gives utilities up to 7 days of lead time. And of course, there's lots of uncertainty at those longer lead times. But as we approach a storm, we provide predictions not just from the National Hurricane Center, but from all of the models. Might have heard of this spaghetti plot or seen all of those tracks that show up on a map. And see, so we run each one of those storms, which has a different track and intensity, which allows us to come up with an ensemble of predictions for each event. And so they can say, well, what's the probability we're going to have more than 100,000 customers out or more than 500 damaged poles? They can look at the best case, they can look at the worst case. And we have within our tool the ability for them to actually make modifications to the track and intensity. A slider where they can say, well, what if this makes landfall as a category 4 instead of a category 3? Or what if it slows down? Or what if it shifts 60 miles to the west? What would that look like? And so this data-driven machine learning model approach puts tools in their hands to make better decisions so that when they're having to request crews through mutual aid, they can do that knowing what the likely impacts are in their service territory.
With a hurricane, I would think that you already have scales, right? You would already know ahead of time what your resources are. So is this more effective than for immediate use, the storm's a day or two out, or is this planning using models, a year out, saying here's a class 3 storm, here's a class 4 storm, here's the kind of budget we need and the kind of resources and mutual aid agreements we need to have in place?
Yeah, it can be used for both. Often the most difficult decisions to make are the ones in the 72 hours before an event. And the reason that that's challenging is there's still substantial uncertainty in the track and intensity of the storm. And it's at that time window where if they want crews, let's say if we're talking about a Gulf Coast utility and they're bringing in crews from upstate New York, you got to get those trucks rolling days before the storm makes landfall if you want them to be in place so that they can efficiently respond after the storm moves through. So it's too late to wait for the storm to make landfall before pulling the trigger on how many contract crews you're going to bring in. And so our goal is to help them minimize the uncertainty around those decisions. And if you make the wrong decision, these are pretty costly in terms of their budgets, because if you're bringing in lots of people, putting them up at the Hampton Inn, feeding them a steak dinner, paying them double overtime, and then the storm shifts and misses your service territory, they're just going to head home and you've spent that money and you can't recoup it. On the other hand, if you get caught short, then obviously there's both the prolonged outages that your customers will experience and the associated health and safety challenges that go along with that, but also the reputational cost to utilities and the scrutiny that they receive from utility commissions when they're called to respond to their performance on the storm restoration.
You mentioned this program called Mutual Aid. That sounds like a very well named program, so I can guess at what it is, but it's not something I'm actually familiar with. So this is an agreement between utilities to support each other during outages. Is there more to it than that?
Yeah, so the mutual aid approach is something that utilities have developed over a long period of time, and there are regional collaborations amongst utilities where they share resources, and where they cooperate in this pre-storm, and in the storm recovery. And so it is designed to streamline the process by which utilities can request the resources that they need, that they can onboard those crews into their system. So get them into the payroll system and into the dispatch system so that they can effectively manage and deploy those resources. And this is all done well in advance. So these agreements are in place well before the storms occur. And it provides an organized way for utilities to request the resources they need from areas that are outside of the expected uh, impact zone from a particular hurricane or winter storm.
I think that's pretty interesting. You got the mutual aid set up. Now, how personalized are these plans? I mean, how the impact would vary, right? Two different utilities have very different infrastructure, different tools at their disposal. Help me understand how this gets unique to an individual utility and how granular this gets.
Right. So there is various scales at which information and these predictions are made. Um, the Ultimately, this needs to get down to a particular service center and a particular dispatch area where a crew is sent to a trouble spot to fix a broken pole. But before a storm, you're not going to know exactly which poles are going to be broken. And so we are aggregating those in terms of outage management areas or service center areas or districts, and providing them with aggregated totals to say, we expect 200 poles and 100 transformers are going to need to be replaced in this particular district. And here's the uncertainty bands around those conditioned on the particulars of the storm event. And then they can roll those up to an operating company total or to a utility total. So some of the utilities that we work with are in different states. And so they may have impacts that are both in Texas and Oklahoma, for example, or in Ohio and Indiana. And so obviously they can't dispatch crews from Ohio to Indiana if both those states, both those operating companies are going to be affected. But they could bring in crews from other parts of the company, other service territories that are further afield. So there's the internal part, as well as the external part. So the external part says, okay, we don't have enough people within our company to do this restoration. Now we need to ask our friends through mutual aid, and this could be other utilities in the United States, or for big restorations, or especially in the northern tier of the US, utilities from Canada also send crews to the US to help with restoration. And so each utility is doing this estimation on their own. So no one is going to tell their neighbor, their competitor or fellow utility, here's how many crews we think you need. Each utility needs to make that determination internally, and then these are grouped into a regional estimate, and then the mutual aid can happen from there.
Thank you for explaining this. I actually saw some of the impact of it. It was I was driving up to see the eclipse, and it was after I think a pretty big windstorm in New Hampshire, and literally every parking lot I drove by was full of bucket trucks. And it was I was just like, what is going on? And it literally looked exactly like that. Like every single bucket truck from, 100-mile radius had converged on this area for storm damage repair. But so great to hear that that's a program that's out there, and it seems like that's essential for storm recovery. But we're seeing now more different types of storms in multiple places. So is this a system that can really carry us through the next generation of storm damage? And are there any new techniques? I feel like we're all used to hearing the typical refrain of vegetation management. Okay, great, we can go out and trim the trees. Everybody then always asks about, well, what about undergrounding? Oh, and it's too expensive. So where does this go? We're in the current moment of the current systems of just send all the bucket trucks, clean up the storm damage, don't really change any long-term behavior. But you said you're also helping utilities look ahead. What are those initiatives that can be put into place to make the entire system more resilient?
Great question. And yeah, we work on these two different time scales, one which is very short in the days to hours before a storm occurs, and one which is much, much longer, looking ahead decades to say, what does the grid of the future look like? And how can we use climate information to more intelligently design and build and potentially to improve the organization, the structure of the grid today. So for us, that is something that we use some of the same data-driven machine learning models that are trained on the historical performance of the grid. But then we're looking at hotspots where there are challenges with reliability. Perhaps every time there's a thunderstorm, this particular circuit is taken down. And so, how do we can use that information and provide it to utilities to say, you have a limited budget for doing hardening and for enhancing the grid. So, where's the best place to spend that? Where are you going to get the biggest ROI from investment? And the type of investment really varies depending on the utility and depending on the types of storms that they're susceptible to. And so this could be something as simple as, hardening, replacing wood poles with steel or concrete. Or there are those more expensive options that you mentioned related to undergrounding. And those utilities are using strategically in certain areas, and the technology is getting better to more efficiently and cost effectively do that undergrounding. But in general, that's not going to be kind of the magical solution for these long-term climate resilience questions. And so I actually think that other strategies like microgrids and distributed generation and a smarter automated switching system that can self-heal the grid when there are outages or damage that occur are going to be the more optimal solutions in the future. And so our expertise is on assessing where and how much risk from future climate change there might be to the grid. And this is, is it in coastal locations where there's going to be more surge and high winds from storms? Is it in low-lying areas where there'll be increases in flooding? Is it in exposed areas where we have higher gusts associated with derechos or winter storms? And so we provide them with the information on the climate risks and how that's going to change in the future, how the probability of damage and outages will change. And then we let them assess, given their budget, given their operational constraints, what's the best solution? How can they most effectively utilize their resources to enhance the resilience?
Let's make this more tangible. Who are the they, or maybe you can give us a use case of where someone's using your technology and how they use it.
Sure. So on the short-term storm preparation part, we're working with Gulf Coast utilities in Alabama and in Texas, and we're working with East Coast utilities in New Jersey and other coastal states. And so we have a large number of customers that we're serving on the pre-storm preparation side that are every day. Their meteorology teams, their storm response teams are monitoring conditions. And it's been a very active year in 2024. And that has definitely driven interest in our solutions as well, because utilities are doing storm response all the time. In terms of the longer term climate risk part, There is a lot of interest out west where utilities are thinking about wildfires and the risk that electrical infrastructure causes. And so they want to reduce their liability. They want to increase the resilience of the grid in those locations. And so that requires them to think about big investments in reducing that wildfire risk and deploying this to say, well, where are those places where they're going to see, because of storm conditions, the highest likelihood of ignitions occurring?
You're talking a lot about weather. You talked about meteorologists. Where is this data coming from? How are you doing a better job than their current meteorologists of helping them make predictions?
Sure. So we don't necessarily pretend or state that we're going to do a better job than their meteorologists. Their meteorologists have a great deal of experience, and they also have the benefit of knowing their grid and their infrastructure and working every day with the people on the ground who are doing the restoration. So we tend to partner with their meteorologists and co-develop solutions that build on the existing products and services that they provide. And so our advantage is that we are combining the weather and climate information with a whole host of other data sets that they don't have access to, and to do it in a way that is automated and that is objective and that improves over time. And so the secret sauce is in pulling together the information from hundreds of different features, things like soil conditions, soil moisture, vegetation type, the height of vegetation, health of vegetation, the age and health of system assets, the historical performance of the grid in those locations, and multiple weather forecasts, all within a family of machine learning models that are trained and validated using the historical performance on their system. And we can do that more quickly and more cost effectively and more accurately than their in-house teams, because it's something that we do all the time. So where we need their help is when we show them the results and we say, hey, it did really well with these storms. And oh yeah, it missed the forecast. It underestimated a bit or it overestimated a bit for this forecast. Why did that take place? And they'll be like, oh, well, that's a part of our grid that was just recently built out. Or, hey, we had vegetation crews go through there just last month. Or, oh, it was just one single, there was actually a squirrel that took out a substation. So that wasn't a weather related outage at all. And so that is where the partnership comes in. And so we work very closely with meteorologists, with the storm bosses, to improve and validate the models. And because we're running it in the cloud, that is a much more efficient and cost-effective solution.
Stephen, are there other non-utility stakeholders that might have interest in the same data and analysis? For example, insurance companies, or I've heard multi-year wait lists for transformers. So there are suppliers who want to know more in advance how to be ready to supply the materials for the restoration. Are there individuals? I'm getting notices now. You go on like Redfin or Zillow about the weather risk. Is there an outage risk product for individuals when thinking about buying a home? Are there other solar or generator companies who want to target customers based on outage duration? I could think of a long list there. I know you're still an early stage company, but are there other stakeholders who are starting to show interest in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, great question. And you're right. The sky's the limit in terms of the potential customers and consumers of this information and people that can benefit from it. So, to answer your question, there's a number of stakeholders that we've worked with, emergency management agencies who are interested in understanding where power outages may occur, because there are people who have medical devices that are electricity dependent. And so when thinking about whether to evacuate and relocate those people to a safer location. Understanding the probability of power outages is really important. We've worked with the FAA. They're very interested in understanding power outages and the likelihood that that would disrupt some of their operations. There are FEMA and DHS use cases related to power outages as well. So in the federal landscape, there's a lot of interest at the state and federal levels for this information. On the commercial side, if you think about a Walmart or Home Depot, there are sales that are driven by power outages. So if you are going to have a prolonged power outage, you may acquire a generator in advance, or you may, after the storm occurs, need to buy a generator to keep all of the steak in your freezer from going bad. Or if you're going to be preparing your residents to sustain and through a storm, you may be buying a lot of plywood or other supplies. And so understanding the impacts before these events occur allows vendors to have the right amount of materials in the right place at the right time. And so that they can, I don't want to say capitalize, but they can effectively serve their customers and meet the needs in the marketplace. On the insurance side, catastrophe models are really important. And so understanding the number of claims and the total insured losses from these types of storms. Many insurance companies want to get adjusters out in the field to help their customers more quickly file claims and keep customer satisfaction up. And so those things are opportunities, as well as we're working on developing an individual. So like you mentioned, a homeowner or an individual person may want to have access to an app that says the probability of there being an outage at your place in the next 24 hours is, and this would allow you to make decisions about, should you book a hotel room at the Holiday Inn? Should you, move some of the expensive stuff in your freezer to someone else's house? Should you have a party at your house on a particular day, or maybe go somewhere else instead?
It's an amazing conversation. I just had have one last question. We're running long on time here. What kind of impact economically do you have for the utilities? So how big a savings, or what kind of impact does being able to stage their equipment or have better forecasting make on the bottom line?
Great question. It all comes down to helping them demonstrate a return on investment. And so if you think about a major storm response could cost a utility millions of dollars. And so from a hurricane for a large utility, we're talking about many millions of dollars. And so if we can optimize that restoration and help them get the power back on a few days earlier and with the right number of crews, we can save them a few $1,000,000 per storm. And so the total savings per company depends on how many storms they get. So I don't want to say that I'm cheering for utilities to experience a lot of outages, but the more major storms that they experience, the more times they rely on our model, and the better off they'll be if we add up those savings from each one of the storms that occur.
Well, awesome. I appreciate this conversation. I want to thank you for coming on the podcast today, Stephen. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this content. If you did, take a second right now and like and subscribe to our content. We love bringing you the content. The likes help us get guests, and we will see you again next time on the Insider's Guide to Energy. Bye for now.